Today we have a special video for you guys. It's a collection of 5 stories, and the very first story you'll hear is a brand new story, and the other 4 are fan favorites. Now those 4 fan favorites have all been re-edited for today's episode, so even if you've seen or heard them before, this will feel like a new viewing experience. But before we get into today's 5 stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is writing something very important, go up and nudge their elbow. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the morning of September 15, 2016, an 80-year-old widow named Rita Wolfenson shuffled her way into her kitchen inside of her brick home in Brooklyn, New York. However, Rita was basically blind, and as she made her way into the kitchen, she walked past her table, then her foot caught a basket of newspapers in the ground, and it caused her to stumble and fall to the floor. And the second she hit the ground, she heard a pop. And the second she heard that pop, she felt a shooting pain in her hip, and she knew right away, very likely her hip was broken. Now, of course, this is a huge problem if you break your hip, but for Rita in particular, this was a very, very serious problem. I mean, this was potentially life and death, and she knew it. And she also knew the reason this was so serious was all her fault. Rita lived completely alone and basically had cut off everybody in her life. For like 20 years, she had not interacted with virtually anybody in her life by choice. And basically the reason for this all started 20 years earlier with her beloved son, Louis, who lived with her. But for some reason, 20 years ago, so basically right at the time when she cut off her whole family and all her friends, her son Louis just kind of inexplicably packed up and left her house without saying anything, and that she never heard from him again. And so suddenly losing her son, for reasons unknown, sent Rita into the spiraling depression, and the way she coped with it was basically cutting off the entire world around her, and she just lived in this house, totally isolated, totally alone. And so now here she is, stuck on the kitchen floor with a broken hip, unable to get up or call for help, and nobody is going to come by to help her. Nobody even knows she's in trouble, she's all alone. But despite basically being blind and knowing she's in this horrible situation, somewhere deep down, Rita finds this inner strength. She knows that if she's going to survive this, she has to save herself. And so she kind of rolled over onto her other side, despite the pain in her hip throbbing the whole time. She got herself onto her elbows, and she began low-crawling her way towards the coffee table in the living room that was right near the kitchen. And she finally got over there, the whole time she felt this horrible pain on her side. She gets to the table, she reaches up, and she grabs her phone, which she basically never used because she didn't talk to anybody or take any phone calls. But she managed to get the receiver off the cradle, and she dialed 911. And so a few minutes later, the ambulance arrives at Rita's house. They come in, they find Rita, she's still on the ground. They scoop her up, they put her in the ambulance, and they go to the hospital. And when they get there, very quickly, they put Rita through a bunch of scans and tests, and they confirm, what Rita was already expecting, which is, her hip is broken. However, after telling her about the fact that her hip was broken, the nurses and doctors told Rita that, you're going to have to stay here for surgery, but then after you get out of surgery, you can't just go home. You're legally blind, you're very frail, and you don't live with anyone, and you nearly died from falling on your kitchen floor because had you not been able to reach your phone, you would have starved to death. And so we can't just send you home. You're going to need to think about potentially moving into assisted living, or living with a relative, or having somebody come and live with you. And so they told Rita that what she would need to do is move into an assisted living home, where basically nurses and a medical team would be able to care for her on a day-to-day basis. Basically, she wasn't going to be allowed to move back into her beloved home where she'd spent her whole life. And for Rita, this news was just unbelievably devastating. I mean, not only because that was her home, that's where she spent all her time, but also because it was the last place she had been before Louis had left inexplicably. I mean, 20 years later, she's still dealing with the trauma of losing her son, and that house was kind of like the last memory of her son. I mean, his bedroom had basically been untouched since he left because she was so holding on to his memory. And so after the nurses and doctors left, Rita was left in the room all alone, kind of unsure what to do. And it dawned on her she would need to do something that for 20 years she had completely avoided doing. She would need to call her family. So she grabbed the phone, and she still remembered the number of her younger brother, Joseph, and so she called Joseph up. Now, the reason she called Joseph is, over the past 20 years, the one family member who had basically tried really hard to stay in touch with Rita after she cut everybody off was Joseph. And so she figured if there was anybody in her family who would not judge her for the silence and, being cut off, it would be Joseph. And so a couple of seconds later, a phone rang inside of a house pretty far away from the hospital, but still in New York. And this was Joseph's house, and he was sitting on the couch reading a book, and his wife was in the kitchen doing her thing. And Joseph, he answers the phone, and when he hears Rita's voice, he couldn't believe it. He was shocked to hear her after so many years. But immediately the feeling he had was relief. He and his sister before, Lewis had left and kind of destroyed Rita's life. Joseph and his older sister had been very close, and it had really broken his heart when Rita had cut him off. He felt like if there was one person that Rita would have stayed in touch with, it would have been him. But he didn't judge her, he was ready to hear whatever she had to say, because obviously something big had to have happened for her to call him. And so he asked her, what's going on? And Rita would explain, she fell and she needs help. And Joseph was like, I will be there as soon as I possibly can. And also, I'll have my wife swing by your house to grab, your toothbrush and some toiletries and a couple of things from home to make your stay at the hospital a bit better. But we're going to get through this. I'll be there as soon as I can. A few hours later, as Joseph was making his way to the hospital to see Rita, Joseph's wife was on her way to Rita's house to pick up her things. And so she pulled up in front of the house and she looked up at the big brick house, and it looked the same as it had, 10, 20 years ago. She made her way up to the door. She didn't knock because she knew nobody was home, and so she used the key that Joseph gave her. She unlocked the door. She opened it up, and immediately she was hit with this horrible smell. So Rita was basically a hoarder, and so she had lots of plates of food, and all the stuff just kind of jammed inside of her house, and it was all rotting, and so her house really smelled horrible. Not to mention, Rita basically never went outside. Remember, she kind of was a hermit for the past 20 years, and so Joseph's wife was kind of bracing for a pretty disgusting living situation. But this was far more repulsive than even she had braced for. But she knew she had a job to do, get in there and get some things for Rita. And so she kind of began breathing through her mouth only to avoid the smell. And so she stepped into the house, which again, is piled high on either side of the hallway with newspapers and just kind of junk. And so she began walking through the house. As she eventually turned toward a flight of stairs, she went up to the second floor, and the second floor is the same as the first floor. There's plates of food and junk and all this stuff, and she didn't know which bedroom was Rita's. So she just went to the first door that she saw, then she opened it up, kind of hoping that maybe this would be Rita's bedroom. But the second she opened up that door, not only was she hit with more horrible smells, but she saw something in this room that she was not braced for, something that terrified her to the point where she shut the door, turned around, and sprinted out of the house, practically screaming. And then as soon as she was outside, she dialed 911. It would turn out Rita's understanding of what actually transpired 20 years earlier with Lewis inexplicably leaving, the event that basically caused Rita to shut down and cut her whole family off. Her understanding of that was totally wrong. Rita had always believed that her son had just kind of stopped loving her or didn't like her anymore or something, like there was some sort of falling out. And that's why he just kind of packed up his stuff and left without even saying goodbye. But that wasn't true. Lewis loved his mother. He didn't just randomly abandon her. But 20 years earlier, when Lewis was 29 years old while he was still living with Rita in her house, he died somewhat unexpectedly from natural causes. It's believed he had some sort of terminal illness that he may or may not have known about, and it's unclear if he even communicated that he was sick or that he had this illness to his mom. And so 20 years earlier, he went into his bedroom one night and he passed away in his bed. And his mother, Rita, instead of going into his bedroom and checking on him, just didn't go into his bedroom and instead convinced herself that her son must have abandoned her because he didn't love her anymore, and it sent her into the spiraling depression, and she cut off her whole family, when in reality, Lewis had never left her house. He was still laying in his bed upstairs all those 20 years. And so when Joseph's wife went into Rita's house and went into that first bedroom she saw on the second floor, what she saw was Lewis's skeleton, still wearing a shirt and pants, laying in his bed, obviously deceased. And that's why she went running out of the house and called 911. And so in a very bizarre and morbid way, it was this discovery by Joseph's wife that would ultimately bring Rita back together again with her family. On February 27, 2015, 18-year-old Dalen Pua was visiting his grandmother on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. Dalen, who was a Hawaiian native himself, didn't spend much time in Oahu with his grandmother, and since he was here, he figured he would do the one thing he had always wanted to do, which was to climb the island's very famous and very illegal haiku stairs, or better known as the Stairway to Heaven. These stairs were a very narrow, rusty, not well-maintained 4,000-step staircase that weaved its way up the side of this Hawaiian mountain. It was built during World War II by the United States Navy because they wanted access to the top of this mountain where they had a secret radio station. After the war was over, instead of demolishing the steps, they allowed people to walk up and check out the view, but it was so dangerous and it was not well maintained that they eventually closed it to the public starting in 1987 and literally put a fence up and even put guards out to keep people from going in. But Dalen really wanted to do this, so that morning he tells his grandmother that he's thinking about hopping the fence and making the hike, and his grandmother's like, "That's a horrible idea. Not only is it dangerous, but they're going to fine you thousands of dollars if they catch you doing that." Dalen backed down from what he said and he said, okay, I won't go. And he kind of played it off like, I'm not going to go on this hike. But sure enough, right after breakfast, he slipped out of the house, hopped on a bus, and he made his way over to the base of these stairs. Even though it was totally illegal and he was incriminating himself, he was so excited about going on this hike that he documented the whole trip by posting pictures of it to his social media. And so the first picture begins with him at the base of the stairs where he posts a picture as he's about to start this hike, and then all morning he's taking pictures along the way up these 4,000 stairs. But then around 11 a.m. that morning, the posting stops abruptly and he hasn't reached the summit. And you figure if you're going to do this hike and you're already posting pictures of just the way up, certainly when you get to the summit, you're going to take a whole bunch of pictures and post all of those because that's the prize at the end of this hike. But for whatever reason, the posting stopped at 11 and he clearly hadn't reached the summit yet. And by that night, when he didn't come home, the family was really concerned and they told police. Police launched this huge search for him. They're looking all over the stairs. They got helicopters out. The Navy gets involved. There's no sign of him. He's just vanished. When they couldn't find him after several days, they had to call the search off, and the assumption was, well, you're doing something dangerous. There's a reason this is off limits. He'd probably slipped at some point and fell down the mountain. That's why this is off limits. It's not safe. But when people reviewed some of his last photos that he had posted to social media, they noticed something in this picture. This shot looks like he's just taking a picture of the dense forest around the stairs. But if you look more closely, there is a man very clearly crouched down a little ways down the trail that appears to be hiding. And many people believe that that guy was following Dalen and at some point attacked him. That Dalen didn't fall off the mountain. He was abducted or killed. To this day, Dalen has never been found, and that mystery man has never been identified. Growing up, Colton Louder was a joy to be around. He was always goofing off and making people smile, and he had a really infectious laugh. But secretly, he was depressed and began self-medicating at a very young age. By the time he was 18, he was a full-fledged drug addict, and by the time he was 25, he was in jail on a life sentence for murdering his uncle over a drug-related dispute. Colton's actions had a profound impact on his family, but none more so than on his twin sister, Kaylin. She had known about his pain even when he was putting on that facade of being happy and bubbly and outgoing, and she had reached out to him and tried to help him, but she could never get through to him, and when he was ultimately convicted, it was crushing to her. She felt like she couldn't help someone who was really vulnerable, but instead of just feeling bad about this, she took her sadness about her brother and watching him spiral and turned that into a laser focus on helping other vulnerable people that were struggling with addiction and depression to try to help them before they end up like her brother. and eventually she would get her degree in social work from Utah State. But despite Kaylin's best intentions to want to help as many people as she could, she found it very difficult to find work in her field, and it wasn't uncommon for her to have fairly long stretches of unemployment. And it was during one of those long stretches in 2014 that Kaylin's life rapidly fell apart, and it left everybody who knew her thinking, what just happened? On September 26, 2014, a little after 9 p.m., Kaylin calls 911. She reported that there was this huge, brutal fight taking place in her condo's clubhouse. Basically, it was a restaurant where you could rent it out in the first floor of this condo complex. And she said it was getting out of hand and police needed to come over here and stop it before someone got hurt. The police asked her if weapons were involved. Were people using weapons in this fight? And Kaylin says yes. Guns. But when police rush to the scene, bracing for the worst, they discover that it's just a docile wedding reception happening inside of this clubhouse, and not one person in there reported any altercation happening. They were like, we're being pretty quiet. I don't know where she would have got that from. One guest would tell police that they had lit off a single firecracker, but they showed them what they had used, and there were these little tiny cheap things that made almost no noise. So it is possible that Kaylin could have mistaken that for a gunshot, but it does seem highly unlikely. Police leave, and then 1 hour later, Kaylin calls 911 again, but she immediately hangs up as soon as an operator has actually answered the phone. And the operator calls the number back, and Kaylin picks the phone up, but she's not really speaking. She's mumbling. She sounds confused, and the operator said, hey, you tried to call 911 a minute ago. Is everything okay? Can you tell me where you are? And Kaylin would have a really hard time giving her address to the police. It was like she couldn't remember her address. And she's mumbling, and at some point she says, my roommate thinks I'm delusional and paranoid, but I'm not. Kaylin eventually kind of calmed down and said she was sorry for calling 911, and the operator said okay, and they hung up, and that was the end of the call. The next morning, Kaylin calls 911 for a third time in 24 hours. This time, she's frantic. While she's on the phone with the operator, she's periodically screaming at these two people that are apparently robbing her apartment to get the F out of here, get out of my apartment, you can't be here. And the operator is trying to get more information out of Kaylin, but Kaylin is very distressed. She can barely communicate with the operator. She's half crying, and the operator tells her, can you leave? Can you go somewhere safe? And Kaylin says, no, there's only one way out. This is a small apartment. I can't go past them. And the operator tells them that police are on their way. Just stay in your bedroom. Don't go anywhere. And so while Kaylin is huddled in her bedroom and the dispatcher is still on the line listening, you hear Kaylin's roommate, Carol, walk into her bedroom and very calmly say, Kaylin, what's going on? And Kaylin's like, Carol, get over here. You'll lock the door. Get in here. There's two people in here. They're robbing us. They're out there. They're near the room. And Carol's like, no, there's no one here. The front door's locked. Kaylin suddenly sounds really confused, and she says, well, I can't explain that, but they must have been in here because I heard them. They must have had a key, and that's how they got in, and that's how they got out. And right at that moment, the responding officers show up, and there was no sign of a break-in. Nothing had been taken. It really looked like nothing had happened, unless someone really did have a key. At this point, Kaylin was very embarrassed. She apologized to the officers. She apologized to her roommate, and she ended up calling her mom and saying, I'm mortified. I can't believe I just called 911 3 different times and nothing came of any of these calls. Like, I feel so embarrassed about it. And her mom, being a good mom, told her, don't worry about it. No one got hurt in the process, so it's all good. And so Kaylin moves past it, and on the call with her mom, she starts talking about what she's going to do that day. She says, well, I'm looking to update my resume and submit it to a couple different job openings, and I also want to clean up my apartment. And so they hang up the phone, and everything seems normal again. But at about 5:45 p.m. that night, Kaylin, along with her beloved little dog named Phyllis that apparently she took everywhere with her, were seen exiting the condo and walking out to the parking lot behind their building. Kaylin was barefoot, was only wearing a tank top and shorts, despite the fact that it was cold and raining, and as soon as she puts her dog down because she was holding her dog in her arm, Kaylin begins having this totally animated discussion. Except there's no one there for her to be talking to. About 15 minutes later, she and her dog turn around and walk back towards the condo complex out of view of a camera, but residents would say they saw her crying and going up to a gate that lets you back into the condo, and she apparently couldn't open it, and as she's standing there struggling, she suddenly stops, puts her dog down, turns and starts running away. And the camera footage we have of her is only when she's back in the parking lot, but she's running away still. The dog is nowhere to be found. Her beloved dog she's abandoned. She's got no phone, no wallet, and nobody knows where she's going. Later that night, when Kaylin's family could not get in touch with her because of all the weirdness around those 911 calls, her family just had a bad feeling about it, and so they filed an official missing person report that night. When police arrived at the condo complex, the first thing they did is they reviewed the security footage. And they already knew about her 3 911 calls that had happened within 24 hours, and all of them had been for unfounded reasons. And they see Kaylin on camera, barefoot in a tank top and shorts in the rain, and she's having this animated discussion with nobody before running around and running away. And so police go to Kaylin's family and they say, "Does your daughter have a drug problem? Is she mentally ill?" And her family tells the police, no, she's got no history of mental illness. She definitely does not have a drug addiction because of what happened to her brother. And they explain what happened with Colton and how that had a tremendous impact on her, and how that it actually sent her on a course to help people with mental illness or people who were fighting against addiction or depression. And they explained how she was just really well adjusted and everything seemed okay until these 911 calls started, and now this. So this huge search is launched between the police and volunteers, and actually the Ladder family even hired some private investigators to help them look for Kaylin. But days turned into weeks, and there was no leads. No one knew where she was. She'd just vanished. Then on December 1st, 10 weeks after she went missing, city workers were inspecting drainage pipes down near the Jordan River, which was a river that went by her apartment, and they discovered behind some plants a body that was half submerged, and it would turn out to be Kaylin's. They'd pull her out of the water, and no cause of death could be accurately determined because of how long she had been in the water for. It looked like she'd been in there for probably all of the 10 weeks she had been missing. They were able to determine that there were no drugs in her system, and there was no water in her lungs, which meant she didn't drown. Her body was found 5 miles from where her apartment was, and so initial speculation was she must have gotten hurt and fallen into this river and drifted the 5 miles downstream to where she was found. But they looked at that section of the river between her apartment and where she was found, and the water was simply too shallow and windy, and it would not have been possible for a human body to travel that distance. Which means almost immediately after she ran off screen on the security footage, she covered those 5 miles, wound up at that section of the Jordan River, died and then fell in the water, or fell in the water and then died, but not via drowning. The police officially ruled Kaylin's death an accident, but her family disagrees. They say if you look really closely at the security footage right before she runs away, it looks like she's terrified. More specifically, it looks like she's terrified of someone we can't see on camera. When she's having that animated discussion where it looks like she's talking to no one, further feeding the idea that she'd kind of lost it. Well, there's this huge rock to the right in the video that kind of obscures our view. Behind that is this huge forest, and it is theoretically possible that someone could be back there that we can't see. But no matter what, her family believes that whatever she was doing in her final moments on camera is the key to understanding why she ran off and ultimately died. So you be the judge. Was this a psychotic break, or is there something more? As many of you may know, aside from telling stories on this YouTube channel, I also tell stories on my flagship podcast, the Mr. Ballin Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories. And in addition to that podcast, we over at Ballin Studios actually have a whole slate of other incredible, strange, dark, and mysterious podcasts for you to enjoy. If you're into baffling and horrifying medical mysteries, well, check out my other podcast I host called Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries. Or maybe you want to hear somebody else from Ballin Studios with a far better radio voice tell you a story, like Luke Lamana. Luke has 2 podcasts under the Ballin Studios umbrella. One is called Wartime Stories, which sort of mirrors what he does on YouTube, also called Wartime Stories. It's like the strange, dark, and mysterious meets the battlefield. And he also has a show called Redacted. It's brand new. It delves into government conspiracies and cover-ups. It's wild. Ballin Studios also has shows that are just pure nightmare fuel, like Bedtime Stories with host Richard Weil, who looks into cryptid encounters, supernatural deaths, the paranormal, and everything in between. It's really good. And then, of course, we have Run Fool, hosted by the iconic Rodney Barnes, who's like a true pioneer in the horror space. We were so lucky to be able to collaborate with him, and his show, it sort of delves into terrifying folklore, is just one of a kind. You gotta check it out. So if any of these shows appeal to you, make sure you go check them out by just going to any podcast platform and looking up Ballin Studios. And boom, you'll see all of our shows. Make sure you follow along and tune in each week for new episodes. In mid-August 2013, Mike and Karen Laspisa helped their beloved only child, 19-year-old Bryce Laspisa, get all of his things packed up and into the family car. Bryce had just spent the summer with his parents in their home in Laguna Niguel, California, which is one of the nicest places to live in the entire country. But now that the summer was coming to an end, it was time for Bryce to head back to Sierra College in Rocklin, California, where he was set to start his sophomore year. Once all of his things were packed inside the trunk of the car, all three of them hopped inside and then made the 7-hour drive north to his campus. Once his parents had moved him into his apartment, they gave him a hug and a kiss and wished him luck, and then they left. On their ride back home, Mike and Karen talked about how well their son seemed to be doing. He loved his school, he loved the program he was in graphic design, he was a very gifted artist, he had lots of friends, he had a wonderful girlfriend. It just seemed like he was living his best life and he was on the path to success. So nothing could prepare them for what their son did 2 weeks later. Just a couple of days after getting dropped off at school, Bryce's very close friend and roommate, Sean, and Bryce's girlfriend, Kim, noticed Bryce was acting erratically. Specifically, he was drinking a ton of hard alcohol. Now, Bryce was no saint. He liked to drink and party like many other kids his age did, but the amount of alcohol he was consuming was concerning. Also, Bryce began experimenting with a drug called Vyvanse, which is a very powerful stimulant that's normally used to treat attention deficit disorder. Now, Bryce didn't have attention deficit disorder. He was taking it in order to stay up late at night and play video games. But between the heavy drinking and the drug use, it seemed like Bryce's personality was starting to change. He was becoming anxious and skittish and kind of paranoid. And so finally, Sean and Kim confronted him about his substance abuse and asked him, like, what's going on? What's causing you to act this way? And Bryce would say, nothing, guys, I'm fine. I'm just, drinking and do whatever I want to do. It's not a big deal. But Sean and Kim, they weren't buying it. They were convinced that something bad had happened to Bryce, and the way he was coping with it was by drinking really heavily and taking this drug. On August 28th, so about 2 weeks after Bryce has been dropped back off at school by his parents, Bryce and his roommate Sean were alone in their apartment together. And at some point, as they're sitting there just kind of minding their own business, Bryce says to Sean, hey, I want to give you something. And he takes his diamond earrings out and he gives them to Sean. And Sean's looking at these earrings and he's like, didn't your mom give these to you? Aren't these important to you? These are expensive. And Bryce just says, no, I want you to have them. And so Sean is looking at these earrings, looking back at Bryce, wondering what's going on here. And then before he can even refuse the gift, Bryce is grabbing his Xbox and putting it on the table and telling Sean, I want you to have this too. Take my Xbox. And so Sean is like, I can't accept these two things. These are expensive. These are valuable to you. What's going on here? But Bryce would just say, look, man, I want you to have these things. You're important to me and I want to give these to you. And so as Sean is sitting there wondering how to handle this very strange offering, he watched Bryce pull his phone out and begin really aggressively texting somebody. And then after a while, Bryce looks up from his phone and he tells Sean, hey, just so you know, I broke up with Kim. At this point, Sean knows, okay, something is definitely wrong here. There's no reason Bryce would break up with Kim. They were such a loving couple. They doted on each other. They were very close. They'd just seen each other earlier in the day. Nothing seemed to be wrong. And so now Bryce is text breaking up with her. It didn't make any sense. Plus, Bryce is now trying to give him all these valuable things. It just wasn't really adding up. And so Sean decided he needed to get in touch with Bryce's parents because clearly someone needed to intervene. And so Sean waited until Bryce left. Bryce actually left to go talk to Kim. And at that point, Sean got his phone out and he looked up Bryce's parents and he called them. Bryce's mother, Karen, she picks up the phone and Sean explains that, your son, he's acting strangely, he's abusing drugs and alcohol. And I wouldn't be doing this unless I thought there was a problem. Like, I'm not trying to get him in trouble. I want you to reach out to him and see what's going on, because I think there's a problem. And so Karen was alarmed by this. She had no idea any of this was going on. And she says, okay, I'll reach out to my son. Thank you for telling me. So they hang up. And before Karen can even call Bryce is calling her. And so Karen answers the phone, but it's not Bryce. It's Kim, his now ex-girlfriend, and she says to Karen, hey, I'm sorry to just call you like this, but your son, he just showed up at my apartment, and he's acting so strangely that I actually took his keys. I don't want him to drive. There's something wrong with him. It's hard to describe, but he just seems totally off. And so now Karen's really concerned because just seconds ago, Sean has told her basically the same thing. And so Karen asks Kim, will you please put my son on the phone? Bryce picks up the phone and he says, hey, Mom, and he sounds totally normal. And she asks him, what's going on? I keep hearing that you're acting strangely, and, what are you doing over at Kim's apartment? What's going on here? And Bryce would tell his mom that, look, Mom, I just broke up with Kim. It's a very messy breakup. That's why she's calling you. She's upset, and, that's why I'm over here. We're talking about it. And look, at this point, I just really want to go home. I want to go back to my apartment. But she has my keys. Can you please tell her to give me my car keys back so I can leave? But Karen wasn't really buying it. She knew her son really well, and it just seemed totally strange that two of his very close friends in his inner circle would say the same thing, independent of one another. And so she says, you know what, Bryce, look, I want you to just stay there, and I'm going to fly out there first thing tomorrow morning, and I'm going to just see what's going on out there. And at this, Bryce immediately says, no, Mom, I have a lot to talk to you about, and until I talk to you about it, I don't want you coming out here. And so Karen's like, what do you mean you have a lot to talk to me about? What is it that you have to talk to me about? I don't really understand. But Bryce refused to elaborate over the phone, which Karen thought was very odd because Bryce was remarkably forthcoming with his parents. They had a very open relationship. They were very honest with each other. So for him to not even give a hint at whatever it was that was on his mind that in some way had to do with what was going on here, it just seemed very odd and unnecessarily cryptic. And so Karen gave up trying to get more information out of her son, and instead she put her husband on the phone, and he asked Bryce, hey, what's going on here? Are you okay? And your mom tells me there's some problem, like, what's going on here? And Bryce again just reiterates, look, Dad, I just broke up with my girlfriend. That's all that's going on here. There's no need to be concerned. I just need one of you to tell Kim to give me my keys back so I can go back to my apartment. That's all I need right now. And so Mike felt convinced that his son was totally fine, even though it did seem odd that two of his friends had said he was acting erratically. But from Mike's perspective, Bryce seemed just fine. And so he said as much to Karen and thought, let's just get Kim to give him his keys back, and he can go back to his apartment and we can talk to him later about whatever it is that's going on. And so reluctantly, Karen gets back on the phone and she asks to speak with Kim. And she says, hey, Kim, would you mind giving our son his keys back? He'd like to leave. And so Kim says, okay, I'll give him his keys. And then they hung up, and then Kim got the keys out. She gave them to Bryce, and Bryce left. At about 11:30 p.m. that night, Bryce was in his car. He was getting ready to leave when his mom called him back and said, okay, look, I want you to go home, but as soon as you get there, just give me a call so I know you're safe. And Bryce said, no problem, I'll give you a call. About an hour and a half later at 1 a.m., Bryce called his mom back to let her know that he was home safe at his apartment, and Karen and Mike are totally relieved, and they tell their son, okay, we'll talk to you tomorrow morning. 10 hours later, at 11 a.m. on August 29th, Karen received an automated phone call from her car insurance company letting her know that roadside assistance had been used on their 2003 Toyota Highlander car. That was Bryce's car. And so Karen's totally confused because the last she spoke to her son, he was at his apartment. He was home safe. He did not have any car problems. And so she's thinking, did he get up early this morning and get into an accident and call roadside assistance? Or maybe last night he got into car problems and just didn't tell her about it, but they were minor. And so she calls Bryce, but Bryce doesn't pick up. And so she dials his roommate, Sean. Sean does answer the phone, and she says, hey, would you mind putting Bryce on the line? But Sean says, Bryce isn't here, and he didn't come home last night. Considering the general weirdness around their son's recent behavior, this really shocked Karen and Mike. At first, they thought, we need to call the police because something horrible has happened. But then they thought, well, wait a minute, let's go into his bank statements because he has a credit card that we gave him, and let's see if there's any recent purchases that will allow us to track where he is. And so they pull up his bank statements, and his most recent charge was only a few hours earlier, and it was at a car repair shop in Buttonwillow, California, which is this small desert town right off of the I-5 highway, located about halfway between his school campus and their hometown in Laguna de Gel. And so Karen and Mike assume their son last night must not have gone to his apartment, but instead just kept on driving south in an attempt to drive all the way back home to his hometown of Laguna de Gel. I mean, after all, he did tell his mom he had a lot to talk about, and he didn't want to talk about it on the phone, and so they assumed he must be driving here to talk about whatever it was in person. And perhaps he ran into some car problems in Buttonwillow, California. That's why he pulled over. That's why there's this charge at this auto repair shop. And so Karen calls the auto repair shop in Buttonwillow, and a man who worked there named Christian answered the phone. And so Karen asked him, have you seen my son? He's got red hair, he's got a tattoo on his arm, he's driving a 2003 Toyota Highlander. And Christian says, oh yeah, we saw him a couple hours ago. We responded to his roadside assistance call. He ran out of gas on the I-5 highway. He pulled into a rest stop and we drove to that rest stop and we gave him gas. And so Karen asked Christian, did my son indicate where he was going next? And Christian said, no, he didn't. We just gave him the gas and then we left. But if you'd like, I'd be more than happy to just drive over to the rest stop. It's only about 15 minutes away and see if he's still there. It's unlikely because it's been a couple of hours, but maybe. And Karen and Mike are like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. Would you do that? That would be great. And so Christian hops in his car and he drives the 15 minutes over to this rest stop. And he's not really expecting to see Bryce in this parking lot. It had been almost 3 hours. But he pulls into the lot, and there is the 2003 Toyota Highlander with Bryce sitting inside of it. He's just sitting behind the wheels staring out into nothingness. And so Christian walks up to the driver's side and he looks down to get Bryce's attention, and Bryce kind of snaps out of it and looks up, and he's surprised to see Christian again. He rolls the window down and Christian says to him, hey, I just talked to your parents. They're really concerned about you. You gotta talk to them. And so Christian actually pulls out his phone and he calls Karen and says, hey, he is still here. Here he is. And he hands the phone to Bryce. And as soon as Bryce puts the phone to his ear and he says, hello, Karen's like, what are you doing? What are you doing just sitting in this rest stop in the middle of Buttonwillow, California? We're so worried about you. And Bryce didn't really have an answer. He just kept telling his mom, I'm not doing anything. I'm just sitting here. And so finally his mom stops trying to get information from him and just says, look, please just fill your car up with gas and come straight home, please. And Bryce says, okay, yeah, that's what I'll do. I'll do that right now. And so Bryce hands the phone back to Christian. Christian pulls it up to his ear and he says, hey, Karen, it looks like he's leaving now, so I'm going to take off. Karen thanks him and they hang up. Christian goes back into his car. He leaves the lot, and as he's driving, he looks over at Bryce, and it didn't really look like Bryce was getting ready to leave. It looked like he had just gone back to sitting and blankly staring out of his car. But Christian figured, you know what? He just talked to his mom. He said he was going to go home. I'm sure that's what he's going to do. The drive from Buttonwillow, California, south to Laguna Niguel, California, where Bryce's parents were, was about a 3-hour trip, and so the Los Pisos were expecting their son to arrive around 3 p.m. By 3:30 p.m., when he still hadn't shown up and he still hadn't called, Karen began calling her son, but he wasn't answering the phone. And as much as Karen and Mike wanted to believe their son had just gotten stuck in traffic or something like that, they knew deep down something was wrong. Something was off about his behavior. They just didn't understand what it was. For the next several hours, they continuously tried calling their son, and he never answered the phone. And so finally, by 6 p.m. that night, when he still hadn't shown up and they still couldn't get in touch with him, they called the police and they filed an official missing person report. The police began their search by contacting Bryce's cell phone provider, AT&T, and they asked them to use their cell phone towers to ping Bryce's cell phone, basically triangulate where his phone is located. And once they did that and they had the actual location of his phone, the police and Bryce's parents were shocked at where it was. It was still in Buttonwillow, California. It was located just a couple of miles down the road from that rest stop where Christian had last seen Bryce. It was now in this parking lot of this hotel. And so the police around Buttonwillow were alerted to the fact that Bryce was a missing person and his phone was apparently in this parking lot. And so police were sent over there to see if Bryce was there too. And so the police arrived in this hotel parking lot, and sure enough, right in the middle is the 2003 Toyota Highlander with Bryce sitting behind the wheel, just sitting there staring out the front. And so an officer walks up and he knocks on the glass, and Bryce rolls the window down. And the officer would say, Bryce acted totally normally. He was friendly, he was lucid, he answered all their questions. When he got out of the car and they conducted field sobriety tests, he'd pass all of them. He even said, hey, if you want to search my car, go for it. I'm not doing anything out here. So the officers did search his car, and there were no drugs, no alcohol, there was nothing suspicious in his car. And when they asked him, what are you doing out here? Your parents are so concerned about you. Bryce would tell them that he was just sitting there. He didn't really have much of an answer, but he told them he planned on going home soon. And so one of the officers said to him, hey, you really need to call your mom. You need to call home and let them know that you're okay. And when they told him to do that, Bryce suddenly became really apprehensive, like he did not want to call home. And the officer picked up on it. He said, hey, you gotta tell your family what's going on. They're the reason we're out here. They're concerned about you. So get out your phone and dial your mom. And so Bryce reluctantly pulled his phone out. He dialed his mother's number and he hit call. And the officer said, give me the phone. So Bryce hands over the phone. The officer picks it up. Karen answers the phone. And the officer tells her, hey, look, I'm with your son. He's just fine. He's sober. There's no drugs. There's no alcohol. I don't really know what he's doing, but he says he's going to go home pretty soon. But there's nothing wrong about the situation that I can tell. You need to talk to your son and figure out what's going on. And so he hands the phone over to Bryce. Bryce picks it up, and Karen says to him, what's going on? Why are you still in Buttonwillow? It's been like 9 hours. And Bryce really didn't give her an answer to any of her questions. He just kind of deflected all of them and said he'd be home soon and don't worry about it. I'm just sitting here. There's nothing to worry about. And so finally, Karen just stopped trying to pull information out of her son. She could tell that, again, he was not going to tell her what's going on. And so she changed her tactic and she told her son very gently, Bryce, please just go get a bite to eat, get a cup of coffee, kind of get yourself together here, and then please just drive home. It's only a few hours away. Drive home and we can talk about whatever problems you have, but you just gotta drive home. You gotta leave Buttonwillow. You've gotta come home. And at this, Bryce says to his mom, you know what? Okay, I'm sorry. I'll be home in a few hours. And so they hang up, and the officer, who was kind of eavesdropping intentionally on this conversation to make sure everything was fine, the officer was satisfied that everything was fine, that Bryce was sober, that he would head home. And so he says, okay, Bryce, best of luck, head home to your parents. And the officer left. An hour later, Karen received a call from Christian, the car repairman who had checked on Bryce earlier, and he was actually returning one of Karen's calls. She'd called him sometime and he didn't get back to her, and so he was calling back, and he wanted to know, had Bryce made it home safely, because now it's been several hours from when he saw him last. And Karen would tell Christian, actually, no, after you left, my son did not leave Buttonwillow. He just went down the road to a parking lot, but the police actually were just over there that checked on him, and now I'm certain he's making his way home. Christian, who felt kind of invested in what was happening with Bryce, would say to Karen, hey, I don't mind driving over there and just confirming he has left this parking lot. But Karen would say, you know what, I'm confident. He's on his way. Don't worry about it. You're too kind. So they hang up, and afterwards, Christian, even though he didn't have to, he decides, I'm going to go over there and make sure Bryce really has left, because obviously something strange is going on here. And, if there is some problem, maybe I can assist. And so he drives over to this hotel parking lot, and he really was not expecting to see Bryce there. But he pulls into the lot, and who's still in the middle of the lot but Bryce in his 2003 Toyota Highlander, just staring out the front of his car. And so this time Christian pulls up right next to him. He parks the car, he walks right up to the window, and he's a little bit more forceful, friendly, but forceful with Bryce. He has him roll the window down, and Bryce obviously is very surprised to see Christian again. It's the third time he's seen this car repairman. And Christian says to him, hey, Bryce, you need to go home. Your parents are so worried about you. You need to leave right now. In fact, I'm going to watch you leave, and then I'm going to follow you onto the highway to make sure you're going home. And so Bryce was a little bit taken aback at how forceful he was being, but he would ultimately say, okay, yeah, all right, let's leave. And so Christian gets back in his car, and he goes right behind Bryce. And after a few seconds, Bryce pulls out of the lot, and he starts driving onto the road, and Christian follows him. And for the next hour, Christian would just remain behind Bryce and watch him drive towards Laguna Niguel. And while he was driving, Christian would actually call Karen and Mike back. And he would say to them that, your son had not left, but now he's good. He's on the highway. I'm right behind him. He'll be home soon. And so when Christian and Bryce made it to the last leg on the way to Laguna Niguel, Christian was confident that Bryce was fine and he would get home under his own steam. He wasn't driving erratically. Everything seemed normal. And so Christian pulled up alongside Bryce. He kind of waved to him to say, I'm leaving. and then he turned around and he headed back to Buttonwillow. Shortly after this, Karen called Bryce. Bryce picked up the phone, he's still driving, and Karen tells him, okay, you're gonna give me landmarks of the things you're seeing as you're driving so that I know you're actually driving home. But Bryce refused to give them to her. He would say, oh, I can't see anything out my window, it's too dark, and I don't know where anything is. And so despite Karen and Mike getting so frustrated with him, saying, come on, tell us something, give us a sign, a road sign, anything, tell us anything around you, Bryce didn't give them any information. And so finally at about 2 a.m., when Bryce really should have been in Laguna Niguel or very close, he tells his parents over the phone that he's too tired to continue and he needs to pull over and take a nap. At first, his parents urged him to just keep on going. Come home, you can sleep as long as you want when you get here. But as they were saying it, they realized their son had been awake for nearly 24 hours at this point. And it's the middle of the night, so it does kind of make sense for him to pull over and take a nap. And so they say, okay, pull over, but as soon as you wake up, you need to call us so we know you're back on the road. So Bryce says, no problem, I'll do that. And they hang up. Several hours later, at 8 a.m., Karen and Mike have still not heard from their son, and they're telling themselves that he's probably just sleeping, he's totally exhausted, I'm sure he's fine. And then they hear their doorbell ring, and they're immediately so relieved because they're thinking, Bryce is here, he's finally arrived, thank goodness. They run to the door, they open it up. It's not Bryce, it's a police officer. And the officer asks them, do you own a 2003 Toyota Highlander car? And so Mike and Karen's hearts sank and they say, yes, our son Bryce drives that car. The officer told them that the car had been located a few hours earlier at the bottom of a 25-foot cliff near Castaic Lake. Castaic Lake is about halfway between Buttonwillow and Laguna Niguel. They told the parents that there was no sign of a driver. Bryce was not there. They did find 2 small drops of blood inside the vehicle, but beyond that, there was no indication that Bryce had sustained life-threatening injuries from this crash. They said the back window of the vehicle had been broken from the inside, indicating that Bryce had escaped the wreck by punching out that window. His laptop and phone were still in the vehicle, and his wallet and duffel bag were outside the vehicle on the road and looked like they had been rummaged through before they were left there. After an examination of the damage to the car, the final tire tracks that led down to where it had been found, and traffic cameras in the area, it was concluded that Bryce had actually intentionally driven off this cliff, and he had actually hit the accelerator right before he went over the edge. After Mike and Karen headed out to the crash scene and had a chance to talk to some of the investigators that had been looking for Bryce, they informed the parents that most likely what they were looking at with this crash was a failed suicide attempt. But Mike and Karen, they just couldn't buy that. That was not like their son. And just 2 weeks earlier, when they dropped him off, he was happy, he was excited to be at school, he was talking about the future. He was not someone that was suicidal. And so what situation could he have possibly gotten himself into in just those 2 weeks that was so bad it would lead to something like this? It made investigators and the parents wonder, was Bryce hiding something? What did he mean when he said he had a lot to talk about? Did that have something to do with this thing he was hiding? A huge search was launched in and around the area where the car had been found, with hundreds of people on horseback, on ATV, on foot. There were helicopters in the air. They put divers in the lake. They looked everywhere for days and days and days. But nothing was found of Bryce. On the 9th day of the search, they brought a bloodhound out to see if it could pick up Bryce's scent, and sure enough it did, right at the crash site. And the dog followed the scent all the way down to the lake. It walked around the lake to this bridge. It was actually a dam that went across the lake. It followed his scent right across the bridge to the other side, and then it kept on following it up the small access road until it reached a truck stop, and then his scent just stopped. And so police and the parents and everyone involved in this investigation was really surprised at this discovery. And so police got another bloodhound, a separate bloodhound. They brought it out to see if it could do the same thing, to prove that this really was his scent trail. And sure enough, the bloodhound picked up his scent. It went down to the lake, it went around to the bridge, went over, went to the truck stop, and then it just stopped. But after the scent trail was discovered, there was no other leads for anyone to follow. And so after 3 weeks of looking everywhere for Bryce, the search was called off. Some say Bryce was suicidal. That's why he drove off the cliff. It was a suicide attempt. And despite the bloodhounds picking up the scent, Bryce was most likely in the lake somewhere. Others disagree and say Bryce is still alive. That after this crash, he gets out of the car and he walks down to the lake, he walks around to that bridge. He goes up to the truck stop and then he hitches a ride with someone and vanishes, and now he's living off the grid somewhere. And still others believe Bryce's drug and alcohol use caused a psychotic break, and that was what was causing all the strange behavior, and that was what led him to drive off the cliff. And perhaps when he landed, he sustained a vicious head wound that caused him to forget who he was, and so now he's just kind of wandering around somewhere, not knowing who he is or knowing that he's a missing person. As for his parents, they say he would never do this on purpose. He would never cause this much pain to the people that love him, and so he must have been a victim of foul play. But regardless of what you believe happened to Bryce, something happened to him, and it's probably connected to whatever it was. He said he needed to talk to his mom about, that thing that he couldn't discuss on the phone that potentially he was trying to drive home to talk to his mom and dad in person about. But unless we find Bryce and he's still alive, it's unlikely we'll ever know what it was. Since August 30th, 2013, when Bryce went missing, no one has heard from him and no one has seen him. If you think you have information about Bryceless Pizza, please call this number now. Let them know what you know, because his parents, volunteers, the police, there's so many people still looking for him, and so any bit of information could crack this case. So please, if you have information, call this number below. In 1984, 19-year-old Timothy Molnar was living at home with his parents in Daytona Beach, Florida, while going to school for aeronautical mathematics. On January 24th, Timothy gets up and begins his day just like every other day of the work week, by going downstairs, having a bite to eat, and then taking his younger brother Frank to school. Once he dropped Frank off, he drove across town to his university where he had class. But as soon as he parked, he realized he had forgotten his bike, and that was something he'd brought with him everywhere. And so before class started, he went back home. He got his bike, put it in his car, turned around and headed out. And his mother would step outside and see him trailing away down the road. And that was the last time she, or anybody in their family for that matter, saw him alive. That night when Tim didn't come home, his family called the police. The police asked them, is there any reason he would want to run away? Is he in trouble? Is there anything going on? And his family's like, no, he's a straight-A student. He's got lots of friends. He's super happy. He's well-adjusted. He's on a great career path. There's nothing in his life to indicate that he would want to run away or that he's in trouble. I know he doesn't drink or do drugs. There's really nothing. So the police begin their investigation, and they start by looking at the family's credit card bills because they knew Tim had a credit card that was connected to the family account. And they found there had been a charge placed the same day he had gone missing in a gas station about 150 miles away. And so the police go out to this gas station and they find someone that had been there when Tim was there, and he was able to describe exactly what he looked like, what his car looked like. And the police ask him, was Tim alone? And the witness says, yeah, he was alone. He was acting totally normal. I saw him go into the store and then I saw him come back out again, and that was it. I don't know where he went after the gas station. So for the next couple of days, nothing really happened. There were no leads to operate on, and Tim wasn't getting in touch with them, so they just waited. Then on January 30th, so about a week after Tim has gone missing, Tim's family receives a letter from an auto impound company in Atlanta, Georgia. And the letter basically says, there is a car that's sitting in our lot that is registered to your house. You need to come out here and get it. And so the family goes to Atlanta, Georgia to inspect the car, and they walk up to it, and there's nothing suspicious about it. There's no scratches on it. The tires are all fully inflated. They look inside, and there's no sign of a struggle. There's no blood. There's no debris of any kind. But what they would find inside the car were Tim's credit cards, his wallet, his license, and other items, suggesting that perhaps Tim is trying to ditch his old identity and start a new one. They also noticed a few very expensive items that they knew were always in his car were now missing. His car stereo, his toolbox, and his bike. Tim's family stayed in Atlanta for a couple of days thinking maybe Tim will return to this car, but after a couple of days it was clear that they weren't doing any good sitting there, so they went back to Florida. When they got back, they looked inside of Tim's room a little bit more closely, and they discovered that none of his clothes had been taken. There was no suitcase taken. It was like he left with just the clothes on his back. They also checked his savings account, and he had taken all the money out but left $10 in there. And the family believed that by leaving that $10, what he was really saying is, I'm gonna come back someday. But he didn't come back, and they never ever heard about him again. It was like he just vanished. A decade after Tim went missing, the TV show Unsolved Mysteries aired a segment about Timothy and his disappearance in hopes that the viewers would be able to give them some information about the case. And sure enough, a man named Stephen Cull, who was living in Wisconsin, called into the show and said, "Without a doubt, I know where Timothy is." He told them the story about how 10 years earlier he was walking around this forested area in Wisconsin when he came to a clearing in the middle of this forest, and he saw this lump in the middle of the ground. He didn't know what it was. It was winter time, so he couldn't tell if it was wood or an animal. And he walked up to it and he looked down and he realized there was this huge block of ice. And when he brushed the snow off the top, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Inside of this huge block of ice is the dead body of a young man. Cull would immediately call the police, who'd show up. They would get the body out of the ice, but there was no identifying information on him, and he was very badly decomposed at this point, and so they had no way to identify him. And so he was buried and he was unclaimed. But from the second Steve saw that dead body in the ice, that image was seared into his mind. And so when the TV show Unsolved Mysteries put a picture of Tim up on the screen saying, "If you've seen this guy, let us know," Steven's like, "Oh my gosh, I recognize those clothes. That's the guy who was dead in the ice block." And so the police go to Wisconsin, they dig up the body that was inside at the ice, they do a DNA test, and sure enough, it's Tim Mona. Even though Tim's body was almost completely skeletonized at this point, the coroner said there's no sign of trauma to his body, none. However, they weren't able to determine a cause of death. To this day, we have no idea how or why Tim wound up 1,200 miles away, frozen inside of a block of ice. The official Mr. Ballin Podcast YouTube channel is back. This channel is the home for our exclusive Mr. Ballin Podcast episodes that you can't get anywhere else on YouTube. Which means if you had not been listening to the Mr. Ballin Podcast on podcasting platforms to this point, well, guess what? All those exclusive episodes, all that new content you missed out on, is now going to be available to you on YouTube on this channel. And there are literally hundreds of new stories that have only been audio only to this point. And so we're talking about a whole bunch of new content for some of you. We post at least once a week on this channel, so make sure you subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss an episode. Also, to further entice you to check this channel out and hopefully subscribe to it, I have hidden a behind-the-scenes photo of me inside of my studio somewhere on this official Mr. Ballin Podcast YouTube channel. So go over there, subscribe to it, and find that photo. Now, here is a teaser from one of the Mr. Ballin Podcast episodes. Enjoy. Within a few hours of Detective May's arrival, the Watauga County Sheriff had already made a call to the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation asking for help. And not long after that, the area around the snow-covered body began to fill with members of a state crime tech unit and an agent assigned to work closely with Detective May. It wasn't until after the scene was photographed, sketched, and processed that the medical examiner oversaw the removal of the body. And after one small scoop of snow at a time had been lifted off the corpse, investigators finally got their first look at the nude adult white male who lay underneath the mound of snow. The bare skin of the man's back was frozen to the ground. His wide-open mouth showed a set of straight white teeth. In his left temple, just below the line of dark hair that still covered what was left of his scalp, investigators could see a clearly defined circle where a bullet had been fired into his skull. And on the right side of the man's neck, there was a second bullet hole. There was no sign anywhere of the man's clothes, and no shell casings from the rounds that were fired. But the body was not completely stripped. On the man's left wrist was a gold watch, and on his left hand he wore a heavy gold signet ring with a small center diamond. The only other physical item left at the scene of what investigators now knew had to have been a murder was a 16-inch long strip of electrical and masking tape. The same kind of tape that investigators would later find had been used to bind the man's hands and ankles. To hear the full episode and so many other strange, dark, and mysterious stories that many of you may not have heard before, head on over to the Mr. Ballin Podcast official YouTube channel and subscribe today. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos, click here.
If you find this video interesting and useful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with the latest videos.